Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joan Batorf, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to this session. And perhaps before we get started, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am and many of us are gathering today is the traditional unceded territory of the Silk Okanagan Nation and their people. It's really a beautiful sunny day here, and so we're really appreciative of being able to work, live, and play on this land. I also want to acknowledge that many of you might be joining us from elsewhere, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, past and present, of those lands as well, and I invite you to reflect on your place and privilege of working on and being on that land. So we're delighted to welcome you to this session today. This is the Canadian Mental Health Association Mental Health Week from May 3rd to 9th. And so we're especially delighted to have this talk today to really recognize how important mental health is to everyone and to join in with the Canadian Mental Health Association in raising awareness and celebrating the importance of mental health. Before I begin and to introduce our speaker today, I want to just let you know that you'll notice some closed captioning on the bottom of your screen. You can move that around to a place that might be better for you, or you can actually have it stop by hovering at the bottom. There's a live script button. If you click on that, you have an option of turning off that captioning. There is also an opportunity for you to add questions and comments as we go along and at the end of the session. And I invite you to jot down any comments or questions you have throughout the session at any time. At the end of the presentation, I'm happy to read out your comments and questions to our speaker and invite some discussion. So please use the chat box, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen as well, I believe. So today we're delighted on behalf of the Institute for Healthy Living and Chronic Disease Prevention to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jessica Lougheed, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology in the Irving K. Barber School of Arts and Science here at the University of British Columbia's Okanagan campus. The title of our presentation today is Parent-Adolescent Emotion Dynamics Association with Mental Health. And so perfect topic for celebrating Canadian Mental Health Association Mental Health Week. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lougheed and look forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen and to start the presentation. Okay, so again, I am absolutely delighted to be presenting with on this topic with you today on some research and some general findings on emotional development, adolescent development, and how all of these things are related to mental health. I want to start by introducing myself a little bit. So I am a developmental psychologist, and my area of focus is on emotional development during the adolescent years, and especially in the context of the relationship between parents and their adolescents. So if you yourself were at one point or currently are a teenager, or perhaps a caregiver to teens, or maybe even a professional who works with them in some way, you might already know why the topic of emotion dynamics in adolescence is important, but I will talk more about what the research says later on. So as Joan mentioned, I joined the Department of Psychology here at UBCO just this last summer, in the summer of 2020. And this feels very much like a homecoming for me. So a little bit about my personal story, if we look at this map here. So I was born and raised in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. I spent about 6 years in Kingston, Ontario, where I did my graduate work at Queen's University. After that, I spent a couple of years for my postdoctoral training at the Pennsylvania State University. And I spent a couple of years as faculty at Purdue University in Indiana. And finally, I'm back here in beautiful British Columbia at UBCO here in Kelowna. So again, I'm delighted to introduce myself to the BC community that will be my home now going forward, which is very exciting. So here at UBCO, I lead the Emotion Dynamics Lab. And again, I am in the process of building up my lab, which I will also talk a little bit more about later. But as a developmental psychologist interested in adolescence and family processes, the two kind of core questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about in my research are these things. So first, how do relationships shape who we are and who we become? And second, how does our development influence our relationships as well? So before I go a little bit further, I also want to clarify that I'm not a clinical psychologist or a therapist. My training is as a research scientist, but these are the topics that I focus my time and attention on. And given these research interests, I'm so honored to be able to have this discussion today as part of the Canadian Mental Health Association's Mental Health Week, where the theme is all about getting real about how we feel. Just like physical health, we have mental health that needs to be well maintained so that we can thrive. So why do we need to pay attention to emotions when we're having this conversation about mental health? I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of cultural beliefs about emotions, and here in North America, I think it's not uncommon to encounter the view that emotions are unimportant or they are inconvenient and they are things not to be expressed, especially the negative ones that might tend to be more uncomfortable to experience. But when we look at some common mental health issues and some of the primary symptoms that go along with them, so here I'm showing we've got depression. Some common symptoms include things like loss of interest, inability to feel pleasure, sadness, social withdrawal. Anxiety can include symptoms such as excessive worry about a variety of topics, things like irritability and edginess. And a broader category called externalizing problems can involve symptoms such as aggression, oppositional behavior, and difficulties managing feelings of anger. So when we look at some common mental health difficulties, we can see that a lot of symptoms actually involve emotional experiences and also things that might impact our relationships in other ways as well. So we can see that emotions and social relationships play a big role, both in terms of mental health difficulties, as well as in our mental health and well-being. So emotions are important. They're not just important for our mental health, they are important for a lot of things. And again, even the ones that might be uncomfortable or the things we might not want to feel. So current theoretical perspectives on emotions suggest that we have them in the first place because they served functions that helped our evolutionary ancestors survive in some way. So one thing that they do is they alert us to important features of the social or environmental context that we're in. So say, for example, a spider, a really big one, started to crawl down my wall here in my home office. How would I feel, or how might you feel if you have that experience? You might feel that your heart rate increases. Maybe the sweat on your hands starts to increase as well. You might have this inner mental feeling of there is danger. And in this case, we might, some of us, especially those of us who might not particularly like spiders, um, that is a thing that can help us, that emotional response helps us to understand that there's a potential for danger in our environment, and that experience of fear can help us to motivate us to seek safety in that situation. So again, the example of a spider is maybe not the clearest example of a potential dangerous threat, depending what kind of spider it is, but emotions, the broader point, are that they are these evolved responses to our social and our evolutionary environments, and they're an important part of our daily lives. So negative emotions such as fear, other things like sadness, not only do they help us to respond to our environmental demands, but they can actually help us to build and maintain relationships with others. So if we are sad, we might seek support from someone who's close to us, and that can be an experience where that relationship is strengthened. Positive emotions such as love, joy, happiness, excitement, those can also serve important social functions in terms of facilitating connection and bonding. So again, both positive and negative emotions can serve those important functions. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the current theoretical perspectives say about what are the functions of some of these negative emotions. Again, we don't always want to feel these things, but as I say over and over again, they do have some functional significance that's helpful. So anger is an interesting example where the proposed function of anger is that it can actually help us to overcome some kind of a perceived injustice, a violation of boundaries, or a blocked goal. So when you think about what you're feeling when you feel angry, you might feel kind of amped up and ready to engage with the environment. And so that kind of experience can help us to take action when we have experienced any of these types of situations. I also want to point out with anger too that it's crucially important with how we express it. So there are healthy ways to express it in our relationship. We have to make sure that we are expressing it in a way that is not hurtful to other people. But again, if we feel anger, that's an important signal to us that perhaps we have experienced something in our environment that has prevented us from doing something that we wanted or needed to do. The proposed function of fear, as I've already talked about a bit, is to help increase our attention to the environment and to seek safety when needed. Guilt is an interesting one because we don't always think about how adaptive this emotion can be. But guilt is something that we might feel when we say we messed up in some kind of a social situation, made some kind of a social transgression. Guilt can actually help us be motivated to repair that situation and to make amends with others. So the function of shame is to kind of promote that repair process and can help us to maintain relationships. One of the functions of sadness is that it can motivate us to get help or seek support from others when we are experiencing a loss or another type of big problem that we might not be able to solve on our own. And disgust is something that we can experience in relation to objects or substances and also people. And that feeling of wanting to create distance is one of the helpful functions of it. It helps us to avoid potentially harmful substances and people. We learn how to express emotions starting all the way in infancy, all the way back developmentally in infancy and early childhood. So everyone has emotions, but some people do tend to be more aware of them than others as they grow up developmentally. And learning those things does tend to happen first in the family context. So particularly interactions with primary caregivers, such as mothers and fathers. And I also want to point out too that different cultures, even different families within different cultures, have different norms about how and when to express emotions. So these norms are called display rules. And just one example of a display rule would be in our society, probably that it would violate a social norm to laugh at a funeral, for example. That's an example of a display rule. When and how is it appropriate to express which types of emotions? Emotion socialization is the process through which children and youth learn through interacting with family members how and when to express certain emotions. So this is a big topic, but this process can actually happen in a lot of different ways. One being if primary caregivers are directly teaching their kids and their youth what to do or what not to do in terms of emotions. They also indirectly model their own emotional expressions, and kids pick up on that. And then also in terms of how parents respond to their children's emotions, are they accepting of their child's emotions? Do they help their kid to understand their feelings? Or do they communicate to their kids that they see emotions as unimportant? Those are all kind of very powerful ways that emotions are socialized in the family context. Through this process of emotion socialization, we also learn how to regulate our emotions. So emotion regulation, one common definition that we use is the ability to modulate the onset, timing, and intensity of emotions. So for example, how do you go from being angry back to a much more calm or neutral state? Or how do you go from feeling neutral to being able to feel happy and joy? So emotions, and specifically the ability to regulate them, are crucially important to mental health and well-being because this ability is something that helps us to do things like form and maintain relationships with others, to focus on our work or school, and all those kinds of things. There are a lot of different ways that emotions can be regulated. Things like emotional strategies are things that we may or may not do intentionally, such as suppressing a feeling. So that would be when we feel an emotion on the inside, but we don't show it on the outside. And suppression can be a really adaptive strategy in some situations. So let's just think of the example that we may be disappointed by a gift that we received from someone. But instead of expressing that disappointed, that disappointment, we instead feign delight. And that can help us to maintain that relationship with the gift giver instead of, making them kind of feel bad for that nice gesture that they made. But an important distinction is that even though a strategy like suppression can be adaptive in some situations, the habitual use of that strategy, using it a lot at the expense of other types of strategies, can actually have negative effects over time on our well-being. And especially in the case if we never bring emotions through their full cycle of expression. So there are lots of different behavioral strategies for emotion regulation, and suppression is just one of them. But what's interesting is that difficulties regulating emotions are a common, what's called a transdiagnostic factor in several mental health issues. So this means that they commonly present among many different types of mental health issues that we might experience. How do we then support somebody else who's experiencing a strong emotion? So this could be a family member, a child or a teen, a partner, a friend, a roommate. How we respond to those people in those moments depends partly on what I'm going to call our philosophical view on emotions. The things that I'm going to talk about in this next section apply to any kind of close relationship, but I'll be framing it in an example of a parent or other primary caregiver who is supporting their child or teen. I want to dig in first a little bit more to this topic of parental meta-emotion philosophy. So this is a mouthful to say, but what this means, this is a term that was first put forth by Dr. John Gottman, and we now have decades of research that's accumulated showing the importance of parental meta-emotion philosophies in terms of how emotions are socialized in the family. So meta-emotion philosophy means basically the thoughts or the attitudes that we have about emotions. And through his research, he initially described two different parental meta-emotion philosophies that have really important implications for mental health and outcomes in children and teens. So I'm going to walk through some quotes that illustrate this first type of meta-emotion philosophy that he discussed. So this first quote from a parent with this stance would say something like, "Anger is from the devil. I don't think that adults or children should ever express it." Or statements like, "I can't afford to be sad." Or even, "What could a child possibly be sad about?" So all of these different attitudes about emotions fit under the category of what Dr. Gottman called the dismissing meta-emotion philosophy. And these are parents who see their child's negative emotions as unimportant or something that needs to be resolved quickly and shut down. So the other meta-emotion philosophy that he identified, parents are more characterized by these types of statements. So when they see their child as having a negative emotion, they say something like, "I see that you're angry and frustrated. Is there anything else that you're feeling?" Or, "When I'm sad, sometimes it helps to talk about it." Or, "When I'm quiet, sometimes I'm worried about something." And so he called this meta-emotion philosophy the emotion coaching meta-emotion philosophy. And so these are parents who see their children's emotions as opportunities for learning and developing intimacy. They help the child through the emotional experience instead of shutting it down. And that is one of the core features of how kids and youth learn how to eventually regulate their emotions on their own. They internalize these lessons that they have through interacting with their parents. What we haven't talked about yet exactly is what effective emotional communication can look like in families or other types of relationships from this emotion coaching perspective. So let's walk through a concrete example. Okay, so this person here in blue, this is your child. We could pretend it's your roommate or your partner or somebody else. This person here in red, this is you. And maybe this is an experience that you've had before. Your child comes up to you and they are visibly upset. They've got the frowny face, they've got the downturned eyebrows, and they say, "I only got 90% on my last assignment." What would you be thinking in response to that? And then what might you say? So maybe you would say something like, or you'd think to yourself, well, 90% is really good. I don't understand why they're upset. And maybe you would say something like, "But 90% is awesome. You should be proud." So again, this is an example of where we have a good intention to help our child to feel better at a time when they're really upset. But let's kind of take the opposite perspective for a bit. Let's say that you're feeling really upset and you went to someone for help, and they responded to you in this way and just said, "Oh, but this isn't a problem. You should feel great." How would you feel? You might feel like they didn't get you. And maybe they're trying to make you feel better, but unintentionally, they kind of minimize the importance of your feelings and maybe even invalidate them. So, when we're talking about emotion coaching, one part of it involves being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes. You don't have to feel exactly what they're feeling, and you might not even agree with their emotional response to that situation, but you might be able to see how they had gotten there. And with an example like this, when I give this example in my classroom to students, students generate all kinds of possible examples for why someone might be upset for only getting 90%. Maybe they needed a perfect score to avoid failing the class, or other things that might be going on, right? So the reasons behind these things might not always be immediately apparent. And the better that we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes, the better we can understand them and help them through a difficult negative emotional experience. So what we do instead is we validate. So validation is a really important part of emotion coaching, and it involves putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, seeing or feeling their pain, and connecting it to times where we felt similar things. We also convey an understanding of what it feels like to have had that experience. And we move from a but to a because. So this part is one of the reasons why truly validating can be so hard. It's because we all want to go to the because. We want to move to the but instead of a because. So I'll walk through a couple examples. So let's take this statement here. I get that you're disappointed, but you should feel proud. So that's a but example. Let's look at the because. I get that you're disappointed because you worked so hard for so long and this assignment was really important to you. Do you see the difference there? It's interesting how hard it is to make this little switch. Validation is surprisingly hard to do in practice. And when you break it down, it's part of the reasons why it's so hard is because there are a lot of common traps. So some of the common traps with validation involve something called being the cheerleader. So this is when we want to go to the bright side right away. And we might be doing that with good intention, but it might not show the other person that we actually understand where they're coming from. It doesn't meet them where they're at, so it might not be helpful. And then they might actually end up feeling misunderstood, which could have the unintended consequence of them feeling worse after that interaction. Another common trap is called explaining the logic. So this would be saying things like, it's not hard, you just have to do X, Y, and Z. The issue here is that they might actually know what the steps are, but there are probably other reasons for why they're struggling. So like with being the cheerleader, explaining the logic doesn't convey that you know where they're at. And if they're highly emotional, they might not be able to, in that moment, take in or carry out the logical steps anyways. Another common trap is called correcting reality. So again, even if this is a situation that this person has done before successfully, there could be other factors. And so this trap also has the same issues as above, that all of these are well-intentioned, but might unintentionally convey that you don't understand where they're at. So what do you do instead? Well, you emotion coach. And there are 5 steps. So let's walk through this. And I think this will also highlight just how hard it is to get these steps right. So the first thing to do is to be aware of the emotions of people around you. You can't address something if you're not aware of what other people or even what yourself is feeling. So attend to the emotion that your child or your partner is showing. Make a note of what you're feeling in response. Then label the emotion to your partner, to your child. You could say something like, you look upset. Is there something going on? Sometimes we don't want to put too much, we don't want to read in too much into what the other person is feeling. We want to kind of let them define their experience in their own words. So you could always mention something observable, such as, oh, your shoulders look really kind of slumped down and heavy. Are you feeling sad today? Or something like that. After we label the emotion, then we can validate that experience. So we just talked about ways to do that. And this is one of the most powerful pieces of emotion coaching. So if your child feels like no one understands, they will be less likely to share with you in the future and might shut down their feelings and keep their emotions to themselves or numb. And again, this is when we're talking about mental health, those things can be quite negative in terms of leading to mental health difficulties. So after you validated, then you can meet the need associated with the emotion. So these are the things that help that intense emotional experience kind of come back down a little bit, decrease in intensity. So for example, sadness, soothing can help to bring that emotion down with the experience of shame. Reassurance can help bring that emotional experience down. And only after doing these 4 steps do we go to step 5, which is meeting the behavioral or the tangible need, also known as problem solving. So what is so interesting is that we're all really good at step 5. We see someone having a problem, we want them to feel better, so we jump right into problem solving mode. And that's usually the first thing that we do. Maybe we make that step 2, maybe we make that step 1. Oops, there are some resources coming up next. But if we go there too early, when the person is not yet ready to solve a problem, they're not going to be capable of that. And then again, we can see some of these unintended consequences of not showing the other person that you're with them. So if you found this information helpful, this comes from something called emotion-focused family therapy. If you Google emotion-focused family therapy, you'll probably find this website. The same group also has this website here, mentalhealthfoundations.ca/resources. It's full of really great practical resources for not only caregivers of children and teens, but also professionals who are working with children and teens too, in this kind of around emotions, teaching about emotions and stuff like that. So I just wanted to make sure you had some time to copy down those websites if this was of interest to you. So to take a bit of a segue now, speaking of strong emotions, who has them? This is a trick question because we all do, right? But there are reasons developmentally why adolescents specifically tend to experience more emotions more intensely than at other periods of the lifespan. And there are specific developmental reasons for that. So this figure here, I've included this intentionally because it's overwhelming to look at. But basically what it's showing is age along the x-axis here from age 6 to 21 years old. And here we summarized a body of research on various types of changes that happen during adolescence across biological, psychological, social domains, along with their typical variation in timing. So we've got andronarchy that happens before puberty. We've got the development of secondary sex characteristics. We've got physical growth spurts, brain development, changes in depressive emotion feelings, family conflict, onset of substance use, all these kinds of things. And so to just kind of cover some of the highlights, examples of biological changes of adolescence are puberty and the growth spurt. Psychological changes include things like being able to think in more abstract ways, to consider different possibilities, but to also have metacognition, which is the ability to think about our own thinking. So all of a sudden, adolescents are capable of much more insight into themselves than they were in childhood. Social changes include greater autonomy from the family context, spending more time with peers outside of the home instead of with family. School transitions are common, such as from elementary to middle school or middle school to high school. And emotional changes include emotional experiences tending to become more intense, but also more variable. So what I mean by variable is unpredictable. And so there are some reasons behind some of these emotional changes that are related to brain development. So this is some research that's come out of Dr. BJ Casey's lab, where we have this model. This is kind of a general figure here of brain development, 2 specific networks with age here along the x-axis and development along the y-axis here. And she has shown from her neuroimaging work that regions of the brain that are implicated in processing reward, these are the limbic regions of the brain, develop rapidly around 13 to 15 years old. So there we see this quick development. In contrast, parts of the brain related to the prefrontal cortex develop a lot more slowly. And there are regions of the brain implicated in things like self-control, long-term planning, working memory, all these kinds of higher order cognitive abilities that help us with things like self-control. And you might be surprised to learn that those regions of the brain typically aren't fully developed until age 25. That's maybe older than we might tend to think about it. But what this means for adolescent development is that there's this developmentally typical gap between emotional processing and self-control. I want to bring in some other research on emotional development while I talk about this stuff too. And this is work from Dr. Leah Somerville's lab, and I was able to see her present on this work a couple of weeks ago at a conference. So not only do emotions become more intense and variable, they also become more complicated. So the term that we use to describe the ability to distinguish among many different types of emotions that are similar in kind is emotional granularity or emotional differentiation. So granularity is the ability to separate emotional experiences into different types. Basically, how specifically can someone distinguish between emotions? So an example of low granularity, and we tend to see this in infancy developmentally up to a certain point, infants can only experience pleasant versus unpleasant or good versus less good emotional states. But emotions become more differentiated through development, although even in adulthood, some people show more granularity than others. So someone who has high emotional granularity can distinguish between emotions that have similar things in common, such as depressed versus bored versus tired or miserable, for example. Or people with high granularity might have an awareness of complex emotions like being angry at someone, but also feeling ashamed for feeling angry at them. There's some complex meta emotions that can happen as well, like when we feel things about how we feel. So not surprisingly, high emotional granularity is associated with mental health and well-being, and also with the ability to select and use appropriate emotion regulation strategies according to the situation at hand. The way that Dr. Somerville interprets her data here, so we have age from age 5 to 25 years along the x-axis and the level of emotional differentiation along the y-axis. She saw in her data that emotion differentiation gets lower across middle childhood as emotions start to become more complex, again, with these new cognitive developments. Around age 15, that kind of the trough is at its lowest and emotions are complex and unclear. Before emotional differentiation starts to increase again with age, and those complex emotional experiences tend to become clearer and more specific with age. So I want to put these two things together and just point out that what happens when we have all of these things going on with adolescent development at the same time. These processes tend to co-occur. We have a period of potentially high emotionality, emotions at times being relatively complex and unclear. That's coupled with relatively low self-control. So again, I also want to point out too that there are some negative stereotypes about the adolescent years. There is really wide variation in what adolescent development looks like for any single individual. So again, it's not that all adolescents are highly emotional and fully dysregulated and all kind of those things. We see a lot of variation as well. But I want to return to this idea of emotion coaching. So when we understand this typical developmental context of adolescence, we can think about how we can help preteens and teens make sense of their strong emotions through something like emotion coaching. And now we have an extensive body of research that's shown that helping kids and teens to better understand their emotions helps them to become more capable at regulating emotions, and then in turn have greater mental health and well-being and be at lower risk for mental health issues. So what happens between parents and teens during the adolescent years? And again, the first thing that might come to mind are conflictual images like these. Teens are not listening to their parents. There's a lot of conflict. And as I mentioned, this view is an oversimplification, I do believe, and actually might be based in some negative stereotypes we have about adolescents. But it is true that conflicts do tend to increase between parents and teens during the adolescent years, but there are also lots of important ways that primary caregivers do continue to be important sources of support for their teens, which I'll talk about as well. So conflicts can be a part of healthy development. I think in North America, we tend to be a fairly conflict averse society. But in a safe relationship context, conflicts can help adolescents learn crucial interpersonal skills that will serve them well in a lot of different things: their future romantic relationships, navigating workplace conflict, developing skills like perspective taking, seeing things from other people's side. Um, but they can also be conflicts can also be a domain for that might actually be related to increased risk for mental health issues. And so this would be when conflicts are especially aggressive or they're really intense, they don't get resolved, and they end up potentially degrading relationships. So what really matters is if and how conflicts are resolved. So one thing that I say over and over again to students in my classroom when I teach about family processes is that conflicts themselves are not bad. In a lot of ways, they can actually be a breeding ground for emotional closeness with others, especially when we come out the other side of them, knowing ourselves and the other person a little bit better. But again, we tend to be kind of a conflict averse society and tend to not want to go there for fear that we might hurt a relationship by presenting a contradictory point of view to somebody else. So putting all of these things together, I want to kind of the last thing I wanted to mention too is that yes, conflicts do increase between parents and adolescents, but adolescents still tend to go to seek support from their parents in addition to their peers for specific domains. And that I think more often than not, we see that the relationship tends to be, the highly conflictual stereotype is not a reality for most parent-adolescent relationships. I want to kind of zoom out to a little bit more of my theoretical perspective on these things, and then I'll talk a little bit about my research. So, as we've been talking about, emotions and that adolescents experience are related to their mental health. So, emotions unfold in real time. This is a moment to moment experience. Emotions are fleeting. Over time, through the repetition of certain emotional experiences, those emotions can coalesce into mental health and well being, or potentially difficulties with emotion regulation that might be related to mental health difficulties. So the approach I take in my work involves thinking at different timescales this way. How is what happens in the moment kind of translating into our developmental futures? So emotions, however, are pretty much always social, is the perspective that I would take, and they are regulated in the context of interactions with primary caregivers. But primary caregivers, such as parents, also have their own mental health and well-being. And in the context of close relationships, such as families, we might see there are direct links between a caregiver's mental health and an adolescent's mental health, as in the case of heritability, but also that each person and how they regulate their emotions might contribute over time in ways to the other person's mental health status as well. So I propose that we really take to heart this idea that relationships in families are their own kind of complex systems, and that this can we can't really understand one person developmentally until we understand the social context that they are embedded in. So my proposal is that if we want to understand the role of emotions in adolescent mental health, we have to understand similar processes in close relationships like with parents. Because also parents are still developing too. We never stop developing. And parents of teens, for example, are often experiencing transitions related to midlife, such as menopause, maybe caregiving for multiple generations, such as their own kids, but also their parents, changes to health status. So we take the perspective in my lab that to truly understand how adolescents develop through family relationships, we have to understand what's going on for all individuals. How do we do this? I'll talk a little bit about the kind of research that I do in my lab, and then some of what my next steps are as I get my lab set up. So typically the kind of work I do in my lab involves behavioral observation. So I measure emotions in multiple ways because they're complex. We don't always show on the outside what we're feeling on the inside. And I'm working on getting a behavioral observation lab set up here at UBC Okanagan. So this is a room where we have video cameras in place, different physiological sensors to measure things like heart rate with some comfortable stickers, changes in sweat on the fingertips, again, with these comfortable straps that just kind of Velcro on. And we measure emotions as they unfold in specific types of social interactions. So I'm going to walk through one example of what this kind of looks like in practice and some insights about parent-adolescent conflicts that I've looked at in this way. So this was a study using data that my colleague Alexandra Main at the University of California at Merced had collected. So she had about 50 mother-adolescent dyads or pairs come to this behavioral observation lab, and she had them discuss a topic that they identified as something they tend to argue about at home for 10 minutes. So this is a common way of eliciting emotions in this kind of lab setting. And we examined, so from those video recorded observations, we had trained research assistants identify basically every single second what the mother was expressing and what the adolescent was expressing. So we know at each point in time which emotions are being expressed. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So we have two people, which means that one person could be expressing one thing while the other person is expressing something else. And so we can map that on this type of a grid here, where we have the full range of behaviors we looked at in adolescence here, and the same from others here. So one example of cell F is a moment in time where the mother was expressing some kind of defensive negative emotion, while the adolescent was expressing something like anger, a dominant negative emotion. So we do this for every single pair in this study so we can track over time. The plot points show the transitions between different social expressions during this whole interaction, and we can map that for every single dyad in this study. And then in doing so, we can then unfold these dyadic states into these sequences. So I want you to pay attention to a few colors. Things that are shades of black and gray are one person's neutral, the other person might be showing validation. Red is when one or both people are showing like a dominant negative expression like anger, and blue is when one or both people are expressing a submissive negative emotion such as sadness. So we wanted to look at, well, are there differences? Are there different groups of family members in terms of how these conflicts unfolded? So we used a clustering approach. And you can see just from the visuals alone that we had pretty clearly two different groups. So we have a lot of black and gray in this group, a lot of red and orange and blue in this group. And then we kind of drilled down into the patterns that these dyads were showing in the conflict. So this first cluster showed a lot of turn taking in terms of neutral validation and interest in each other. Also, adolescents had greater perspective taking skills in this compared to this other cluster. And this cluster showed a kind of this mutual regulation of negative emotion, where they're going back and forth between these more intense and dominant negative emotions. And what's also interesting is that adolescents had lesser perspective taking skills than these adolescents here. So this is a complex example, but something that I think about a lot is that we see these differences in how parents and teens navigate conflict with each other. Some are highly conflictual, whereas others are characterized by more validation and turn taking. And what I want to point out too is that it's not that these dyads didn't go to the red or the blue regions at all, the anger or the sadness. They go there, but they don't stay there as much. They're not feeding into each other's negative emotions. So this again makes me think about how conflicts and how they unfold can be these really important ways that teens learn all these crucial skills for how to manage emotions, how to manage social relationships, how to effectively solve problems and learn to see things from other people's perspectives. All those kinds of social and emotional skills are really important for mental health and well-being kind of at all ages, I would say. I will wrap up talking a little bit about my next steps for a couple minutes here. So doing research in a pandemic looks different from doing research when it's not a pandemic. This is not the time, for example, to be bringing members of the community into a small enclosed room on campus. So while I'm getting my lab set up instead, I'm going to be pivoting to this other method that will help us to understand conflict dynamics in daily life. So this is called experience sampling. It's super convenient. So parents and adolescents get prompted to report once per day through an app on a smartphone. Things such as, did they have conflicts with each other? What emotions did they experience with each other? And I'm interested in looking at topics such as, how do conflicts impact next day mood? And what characteristics of families predict better repair from that conflict? Is it related to mental health? I also want to understand how both adolescent and parental development are related to those things. So what we're doing right now is we are designing this study. In the fall, I imagine that we'll be looking to launch data collection. We'll be seeking participation from parents and teens from within BC, maybe from just the Kelowna region, but maybe throughout the province as well. Again, we're still designing the study, so we haven't nailed down those details yet. If you're interested in learning more or interested in having some information about the study come to you, if you're potentially interested in, say, participating with, again, with no obligation, feel free to email me or my lab team here, and we can connect with you in the future. The second to last thing I want to mention is that if you or a youth in your life in BC or Canada are having mental health difficulties, there are some really helpful resources. So one is foundarybc.ca. These are virtual services now for youth, specifically mental health services for youth throughout the province. And then also if you Google HealthLink BC mental health, you'll get taken to a wide variety of resources for lots of different types of mental health issues that might come up within the province. So the final thing I want to say is that research is highly collaborative, and I am grateful to my team of talented graduate and undergraduate students, Gizem, Summer, Sean, and Alyssa, for helping me get my lab started so that we can work on this important work together. So thank you all so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions that you might have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica. That was fabulous. I learned a lot. And so I invite people to add any comments and questions they have to the chat box. I did pop in those 2 email addresses if you want to follow up with Jessica in the chat as well. But certainly invite any comments and questions you have. And maybe I could just start us off, Jess. So I guess I can't help but think about, how our current situation complicates dynamics, emotion dynamics between teens and parents when both are under incredible stress. And so I'm wondering if you have any observations about that, or how you account for those contextual factors in research like this.
Yeah, so this is a really highly relevant in these times. And in some ways, I feel like it's a little bit early to answer this question simply because we were collecting longitudinal data from families when the pandemic hit. And so we had 2 years of data collected on family dynamics prior to the pandemic. And just now we've been collecting data recently from this kind of pandemic time. So in a year or so, I might be able to answer more directly with research-based responses. But one thing that I'm hearing is that to have this kind of sudden change where you're all of a sudden spending so much more in with each other time inside the home, that can be a really positive experience for some families in terms of learning to understand each other better, needing to kind of manage household conversations, and it might be a little bit rocky, but it can result in greater kind of cohesion among family members and understanding. But it can also be a highly negative experience too. And again, I think how healthy and supportive the relationship is might play a role in that as well. So some families might find it very easy to get pulled into a conflict with each other and might find it difficult to resolve those things. So in that case, we might find that the kind of requirement for sticking around home and spending so much more time with family members could have negative impacts on the relationship. One thing that I can share, kind of research from this pandemic, now it's a pandemic study, is that it looks like for both mothers and adolescents in our sample, that symptoms of anxiety actually tended to decrease when stay-at-home orders came into place, where symptoms of depression tended to increase. And again, there'll be individual variation around that, but maybe there's something about less chaotic day to day, or I guess it's more chaotic in some ways, but we are starting to see some interesting and maybe surprising patterns about how this highly unusual pandemic context is leading to different mental health and relationship outcomes.
Great. Well, I'm going to look forward to that, the results of your work in that area for sure. I see we have lots of questions and comments, so I'm going to go to those now. So Lori says, I wonder about applying emotional coping in a mediated session between parent-teen. Any comments on application of this?
So when I hear the word mediation, and I'm curious if this is what this person was thinking about, I kind of think about a third party kind of coming in. So say we have a parent and a teen who, again, when they go into negative places emotionally with each other, maybe they have a hard time getting out of that. And so in that kind of situation, I could see that having a more neutral third party, perhaps a family therapist of some kind, coming in to kind of help coach through more adaptive ways to resolve a conflict or to get out of a really intense negative emotional experience, I think that could be highly effective. And I think that is kind of one of the goals of some types of family therapies, to have a neutral third party there to help scaffold those skills in the moment when they're happening, or in a more neutral context before they actually happen, so they can be put into practice by the family.
Yeah, good point. Stella asks, how do you get someone to communicate when they lock emotions inside and don't share?
This is a really interesting question. And some of the things that we talk about in my class on family processes is that so we all have different styles of how we respond when we're stressed out. And some people kind of shut down and want to just create distance from other people and be by ourselves. And so, kind of ironically, when we try to get that person to open up to us, that might make them close down more. And so by kind of more passively making yourself available without getting too much into that person's space, they might be more willing to open up if they feel like you're not pursuing them too hard, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Great. Sally says, thank you. Very helpful for teaching and content for my first year health course. That's from Sally Stewart.
Hi, Sally.
Henrietta, partway through the talk, there were 2 resources cited. I didn't get a chance to write them down. Can they be posted here? We can certainly send those out. I think when we send out the link to the recording. I have some friends who could benefit from this talk, but we have access to the recording, so we can forward it to friends. And the answer is yes. So everyone who attended, will send you a link to the recording of this session, and it'll be on a YouTube channel. So you're welcome to look at it again, and also share the link with other people. So we certainly encourage that. Great. So then there's a question from Laurel. Why are so many kids in the current generation diagnosed on autism spectrum, specifically Asperger?
That's a really interesting question. And I will say this is outside of my area of expertise. So I have more of an understanding of what are called internalizing problems like depression and anxiety. But kind of my gut feeling is that one of several answers to that question is that, and we see this with a lot of mental health issues, is that we now have a much better understanding of these types of things and how they can present, and simply we are able to better detect them. We're doing more diagnosis. We're better able to see these things when they are presenting in children and youth. And so it's kind of the numbers look like they're increasing, when really the alternative explanation is that there's always been this number of youth who are experiencing these things, but they weren't getting diagnosed because they weren't getting access to services. So that's just my gut feeling on one of what might be several responses to that question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. John asks, awesome presentation. Just wanted to ask 2 questions. Were the subjects in your study mentally screened for potentially conflicting comorbidities like mental illness that disrupt emotional regulation like ODD, ADHD, etc.? Or was this a general sample? Would you think that you would this have changed your observations?
Yes, this is such a great question. So almost all of my research is on typically developing general population. I am doing a little bit of work with samples that have clinical populations, so people who have received formal diagnosis or have a formal history of different mental health issues. So it's interesting that even in this context of a general sample, we see this wide variation um, in how these conflicts unfold between family members. And absolutely, I do think that if we had good representation across a range of mental health issues represented in the sample, we would probably see maybe even other clusters of emotional patterns, or maybe we would see more dyads in that cluster of that mutual negative regulation. I'm really interested in that question, and maybe in sometime in the future, I'll have an update on that question.
That's great. I'm interested in John's next question as well. Would you consider doing other dyads in the future? Father, daughter, mother, son. And I'm really interested in men and boys as well. And so keen to know if other studies have been done in this area with those dyads, or if you're also planning something in this area.
So the short answer is yes, all of it. I'm planning on making that a really key part of my future research. There are some kind of logistical reasons. So much of the research literature that is available on parent-adolescent relationships has really mostly looked at primary caregivers who tend to identify as the mothers. And one reason for that, if we think back to decades ago, of course, we're seeing social changes now, and we continue to as well. But historically, mothers were more likely to be the primary caregivers, maybe staying at home, and are much more likely to be the ones who are going to come into the lab. So you can certainly bet that you'll be seeing announcements from my lab in the future seeking parents of all identities and primary caregivers of all identities to engage in this work. One thing that's really interesting is that there is discussion about how emotion socialization looks really different for youth of different gender. And so youth who identify as male tend to receive messages early on in the family, but also more broader socially, that it's okay to express things like anger, but not like sadness. Whereas young youth who identify as girls are told the message that it's okay to express things like sadness, but not anger. So that's an oversimplification, but I think that that gender question has really important implications for mental health, especially including non-binary gender identities as well, and really kind of understanding across the gender spectrum how that plays into family dynamics and mental health and well-being. Thank you for that really good question.
Yeah, no, I agree. Really important work, and father, son as well.
Yes.
The next question is from Zarka. Can you speak about caregiver-child emotional dynamics when the parent may have a diagnosis of BDP and therefore a tendency towards strong emotions themselves?
Yeah, so this is again something that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but to my understanding, one of the defining features of something like borderline personality disorder is difficulties managing negative emotions. So especially emotions that are really strong and really intense. And so my gut feeling would be that emotion coaching might be something that is disrupted in those family relationships, but emotion coaching does seem to be this highly learnable and teachable skill. So it's not just that we are one way and that we are always that way, but there is a lot of kind of skill building that goes on with treatments for something like borderline personality disorder that can kind of help get that back onto, help emotional dynamics in families within that type of context to have healthier family dynamics.
Great. A question from Elizabeth. We've talked about this a bit. I'm not sure you want to add anything or not. Wondering whether any longitudinal research has shown that adolescents are more challenged now, in quotes, not just pandemic times, but in our current modern fast-paced society, I guess, with stress, anxiety, mental health challenges compared to the past.
This is such a good question, and it has a really complicated answer. So the short answer is maybe. And again, it has to do with now we are much more aware of these issues. And so it means that we are diagnosing more mental health issues because we're more aware of it and more people are getting that kind of help and support. But really, we don't have historical data that allows us to really compare across decades in that clear way. So it's kind of, I don't know if there is a solid answer to that question, but we know that our social lives look so much different now than they did 50 or 100 years ago, and you can't help but wonder if those things play a role. So that's an unsatisfying answer, but to a really important and complicated question.
There are a whole bunch more questions here. I'm not sure where to go because we're almost out of time. But here's one more. We'll maybe deal with a couple more and then we probably will need to close off. Clearly people have found this really fascinating topic. We'll have to have you back again. What influences a parent's decision on repeated emotional coping? Can trauma lead to different types of decision-making when coaching or helping a child understand and deal with their emotion? So I guess that, the role of trauma in all this. And I imagine that could mean any kind of trauma, really.
Yeah, and I think the language used is interesting too about the decision to use emotion coaching versus not. And I think more often than not, the way we conduct ourselves in our social relationships just kind of happens. We're not always aware of how we do things because we've kind of just learned about a lot of these skills kind of implicitly in our own family context. And so I think I would answer this question similarly as I would to the question about borderline personality disorder, is that, again, it really depends. So individuals who have experienced traumas can have such a wide variety of different responses and how that manifests in their emotions day to day. And so I don't know if I can effectively answer that question other than it probably plays a role, and it also depends on a lot of other things too.
Yeah. So there is one common, one of the, a couple of the questions ask about cultural background. And so maybe we could end there and just comments about how this model or emotional coaching fits into various cultural backgrounds. And yeah, so maybe we'll leave it at that. But if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so primarily the massive body of work that we do have on emotion coaching in families does come from the North American and the European context. So again, I think that as a field, developmental psychology is really starting to take the question of culture much more seriously, because what is adaptive and works well in one cultural context might be quite different from what is adaptive and works well in another cultural context. So we do need to be always looking at those multiple layers of what might influence these things. So this is yet another one of those answers that we don't have enough data kind of as a body, as a field of literature to really know how these things might play out in other cultures.
That's great. I can see you've got a whole career of research ahead of you. This has really been fabulous. I want to thank all of our participants for your great questions. And I realize we weren't able to get to each and every one of them, but do reach out to Dr. Lougheed at UBC to follow up. And if you're interested in participating in or hearing more about her future studies, by all means, follow up with her as well. Jessica.lougheed@ubc.ca. And also a really heartfelt thank you to Dr. Lougheed for joining us today and sharing this research with us. We wish you all the best, and obviously we'll have you back again maybe next year for Canadian Mental Health Week and to hear updates on your research. So thank you once again. Fabulous presentation, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.